King of Swindon. Although King George V was the first engine to return to the main line after the 1968 steam ban, today the locomotive is a stationary exhibit at Swindon Steam Museum. This allows us to take a closer look at the features of the engine before we go on to the footplate of 6024 King Edward I to assess some of the strengths and weaknesses of the King class.
The Great Western name lives on in today's train operations. Such was the brand image power of the original company. Carefully developed from its headquarters here at Swindon. Still an important station, it is joined by memories of its glorious past. In 1841, this whole area was a greenfield site, some distance from the adjacent crossroads settlement of Swindon. In that year, Daniel Gooch and Brunel recommended that this site should be selected for the construction of the railway's engineering works, as Swindon was the planned junction for the branch line to Cheltenham and the summit point of the whole line, dividing the easy gradients of Brunel's billiard table to the east from the steeper grades towards Bristol. Today, the junction remains, but the works is no more. Some buildings survive, including a splendid museum, but Swindon is no longer a railway town. However, the picturesque railway village, created by Brunel and Digby Wyatt, and mainly built of stone quarried from box tunnels, still stands. To attract a skilled workforce, accommodation had to be provided, and the railway did so in some style. Typical of the era, different ranks had different house styles, and provision was made for leisure in the shape of pubs like the Cricketers' Arms. The style was described as Tudor, and spiritual needs were met from the Vicarage of St Mark's, built by the railway, as was its associated church, which served some 300 households. The railway also provided New Swindon Park, where, on Queen Victoria's Jubilee, tea for 15,000 was provided, infused and boiled in old tenders by steam from a locomotive. There is no doubt that all this provision created a very strong feeling of community and strength of loyalty to the GWR. The story of Swindon Works started in the broad gauge era, represented here by a replica of North Star, seen in Swindon Steam Museum, which is situated in what was once our shop. In 1923, Churchward's Star class was developed by Collett into the superb Castle class. At the Wembley exhibition, it was claimed that the Castle was Britain's most powerful locomotive, a claim later proved in locomotive exchange trials. However, in 1926, the Southern Railway's Richard Maunsell surpassed the Castle with his new Lord Nelson class. Sir Felix Pole, the GWR's general manager, instructed Collett to design and build a locomotive that would exceed £40,000 of tractive effort and bring back the laurels and publicity plaudits to the GWR. The locomotive he designed would become a superstar, King George V. This is King George V, number 6000. Possibly Swindon's most famous engine, and of course the Great Western's most famous engine. Built in 1927, it went to the Festival of the Iron Horse on the Baltimore-Ohio Railroad. In August of that year, it went on the ship SS Chicago City, and it created an enormous impression amongst American public and locomotive engineers, and it was presented with a bell by the Baltimore-Ohio Railroad. Henry Ford had a very expensive bespoke model of the locomotive made, and it influenced the styling of several American locomotives due to its appearance at the festival. Well, let's have a look at this engine in a little more detail. Displayed in the Steam Museum, the loco is in its final post-1956 double chimney form. The tapered, domeless boiler, Belpaire firebox, cylindrical smokebox and divided drive four-cylinder layout were pure Churchward. The nameplate style would have been recognised in broad gauge days, but the presentation bell given by President Daniel Willard of the B&O earned the engine the nickname of Georgie Bell and commemorated its appearance at that railroad's centenary celebrations. Behind the bell, the inside cylinders drove onto the leading crank driving axle. The outside cylinders were positioned further back and drove the centre axle, whilst their valves were driven by rocking levers from the inside Walshart's valve gear. The positioning of the cylinders necessitated the use of distinctive curved outside steam pipes. After extensive trials in the early 1950s under the direction of Sam L., R.A. Smedley designed a double blast pipe chimney and increased superheating configuration to enable the Kings to cope with the deteriorating quality of coal then being experienced. With a comparatively small grate area and boiler for its power, combustion rates on a King needed to be high to prevent a shortage of steam during hard work. The safety valves were encased in a typical GWR brass bonnet, with the water top clack feeds alongside as normal on Churchwood-derived engines, enabling better boiler control, less thermal stress and less scaling. On the cab side, the engine displays the medals presented to it in the USA. The double red route availability restriction underneath the number plate was due to the King's 22.5 tonne axle loading, which initially restricted the class to the Paddington-Plymouth routes and the route to Wolverhampton. Access to Cardiff and the Welsh Marches route only being granted in the post-war years. To keep the Kings fed and watered, a large 4,000-gallon tender was used. Due to the good availability of water troughs on the GWR, this was smaller than that on comparable engines on other railways. Well, now we're on the footplate of King George V, the Great Western's most powerful express passenger locomotive, and let's have a look at the controls. We should remember that this engine was quite capable of producing 2,000 plus horsepower for sustained periods of time, and on test in the early 50s hauled an 800-tonne train at over 70 miles an hour, so it's an extremely powerful engine. This is the regulator that controls the emission of steam to the cylinders, and therefore this is what makes the engine go. And this has two valves forward in the boiler there to emit steam to the cylinders, a pilot valve or first valve, and then the main valve. And when you've got that main valve open, you really will be making the fireman work hard, and the engine will be telling everybody she's coming. This wheel here is the reversing wheel, and according to which way you can lock and set this by winding it forward or back, determines whether the engine goes in forward or reverse. And it's not a gear, it's which side of the piston you emit the steam to. And as you bring it back towards the centre, towards mid-gear, you will use the steam in the cylinders more expansively and use less steam from the boiler. That will both enable the engine to go more quickly and more economically. This is the all-important component on the engine. This is the brake. This is the steam valve that controls the ejector that draws a vacuum out of the train pipe, and by moving this brake handle to on or off, you can apply the brakes not only to the engine but to the whole train. Fail-safe brake, vacuum brake, and on a passenger train it would work on every vehicle in the train. And this gauge shows you the train pipe brake pressure and the pressure in the reservoir, so the driver knows that he's got a safe brake. This is the blower valve. This provides an artificial draft on the fire by a steam jet in the smoke box, and this is used in raising steam. It's also used to protect the footplate crew against what's known as a blowback, which if you shut the regulator and therefore cut the draft on the fire from the exhaust or run into a tunnel at high speed, draft can reverse and the fire can blow back out through the fire hole door. A very embarrassing and uncomfortable circumstance on the footplate, so this valve is used to actually prevent that happening. This gauge here tells you the state of the lubrication in the cylinders and on the engine. Very important, because with an engine of this power you can run hot bearings or damage the piston and valve rings very easily. Speedometer is here to tell you the speed, and Great Western automatic train control, which gives you a bell signal at each clear distance signal, or a siren letting air into the train pipe to stop the train automatically if you pass a distance signal at danger. Introduced very early on by the Great Western, of course now being followed in different forms by railways all over the world. The device attached to the regulator here is a pilot valve to allow steam into the hydrostatic displacement lubricators, so the minute you turn some steam onto the engine, it starts the lubrication within the motion work of the locomotive. Up here we've got the whistle chains. Two whistles on Great Western engines. One is a deep toned alarm whistle, which was used right from broad gauge times to tell the guard to put his brake on the train from his end, and equally we've got the normal whistle that would be used on the road. This lever controls the cylinder drain cocks, which allow condensed water to be cleared from the cylinders without causing damage. Water is not compressible and can easily blow a cylinder head off. The roar of steam blown out of these drains is also very effective at scaring livestock and humans off the track. Just behind is the sanding lever, which feeds sand onto the rails ahead of the driving wheels to aid adhesion. This is the fire hole here, obviously, and the firebox. Now that firebox is nearly 11 feet long, and believe you me, when you're working this engine flat out, you can be talking about 100 weight of coal in a minute, and that can be sustained over some period of time. So the fireman has to work very hard indeed, and trainee firemen on this particular engine were actually played a trick on by experienced hands who would tell them they got to throw the coal down to the front of the firebox hard enough to make the bell on the front ring, and what they would do is have a piece of cord which they twitch with their foot when they did it, and several generations probably of young Great Western firemen nearly threw themselves in the firebox door trying to achieve that. So a little bit of humour that's there on the engine. The other controls we can see here, moving over more towards the fireman's side, is the all-important gauge glass. That tells you how much water there is in the boiler. Absolutely key for safety reasons and obviously for steaming purposes. Too much and the engine will prime and take water over into the cylinders, which can cause enormous damage. Too little and the fusible lead plug inside the crown sheet of the firebox will blow, and of course you're in danger actually of having a boiler explosion if you don't take prompt action. Most engines on most railways had 2 gauge glasses. Great Western engines usually had 1. The device around that gauge glass is a protector, because those glasses could fail and break, and that was very unpleasant for the crew, and that stopped glass fragments and so forth flying about, because a lot of steam on the footplate as well made life pretty difficult in dealing with it. The other controls we've got up here are the injector steam valves to put water into the boiler, and of course the train heating valve up there to allow steam heat back to the train to keep the passengers warm. In days before steam heat was invented, passengers either froze or they had things called foot warmers, which were replaced at various stations and often consisted either of hot water or bricks that had been put in a furnace before coming onto the engine. Also, the fireman has the steam pressure gauge over there telling him how much steam he's got, and if it wasn't up to the mark on a Great Western engine, the driver very quickly began to experience the effects of not having that full pressure, and some crisp words might be said on the footplate. On the other hand, with a good mate, he would be trying to help his fireman do what was an extremely arduous and difficult job. If you had a 14 coach Cornish Riviera Express to take out of Paddington, ending up all the way down in Plymouth, an awful lot of coal had to be moved from that tender into the firebox. Also on the fireman's side is the steam heat pressure gauge to let the fireman know that he was putting enough steam into the train to keep the passengers warm. The guard also had a valve in his van at the back of the train, and if you were trying to cut corners on a steep climb and put more steam into the engine and not keeping the passengers warm, you could be in a lot of trouble from what was said in the guard's report. Down below by the firebox door there, you've got the dampers which controlled the emission of air to the fire grate in there, and of course when the engine wasn't working hard you might keep them shut. When it's working really hard you need to keep them open to give the fire enough air, and also to stop the fire bars melting, because if there was no cooling air coming through they could be in serious trouble. Fire doors slide shut from side to side, and the flap down there, deflector flap, which will be pulled up to prevent the admission of too much cold air through the firebox door when the engine was working, because that could both damage the tubes and it would adversely affect steaming. At the same time, having it open with a light draft when coal was being put on would prevent emission of excess smoke, which was the sign of an unskilled fireman. So all in all, if you take the power of this machine into consideration, a very, very simple set of controls, but used by a skilled crew, driving this engine was like an art form, and some prodigious performances could be produced. And indeed, the first generation of diesel hydraulics that came onto the Western region of British Railways, the former Great Western, weren't up to the job and couldn't produce the sort of performances that a King or even a hard-driven Castle could produce. And that was of some surprise to the modernisers, just how much these engines could perform. Really very much a quart in a pint pot, a King, a very small engine for its power output, but nevertheless they did perform, and right up until 1962-63 they handled the key expresses, the heaviest jobs on the Great Western and British Railways Western region. Here, 6024 King Edward I sets out from Parr in Cornwall for Plymouth, territory banned to Kings in steam days, and forcefully demonstrates the tremendous upgrade accelerative and adhesive power of Kings as opposed to a Pacific. A king crossing Brunel's magnificent Royal Albert Bridge is a site that belongs to the preservation era. Joining the Footplate crew, watch driver Brian Dudley Ward takes 6024 out of Plymouth at the head of a 400-ton train with 7325 as assisting engine. This footage from the Devon banks illustrate the problems caused by clinker on a small grate and the skill of the crew in keeping a heavy train on the move in difficult circumstances. As Hemerdon Bank is climbed, pressure drops on 6024 and the mogul provides doughty assistance as the king is worked on full regulator. Having topped the summit, the clinker rake is applied in an attempt to improve matters, but to little avail. Pressure sticks at around 150 pounds per square inch. On the ascent of Dainton, there are anxious glances at the pressure gauge as Brian lengthens the cut-off more and more before the summit tunnel is approached, to great relief all round.